He thought this would be just another interview, just another chance to control the conversation, shape the narrative, and remind the world who truly holds the power in media. But what he didn't know was that tonight he was walking into a moment that would change everything. The air inside the studio was thick, not with heat, but with anticipation. The stage was lit perfectly, every spotlight positioned to highlight the man who sat comfortably in his chair, legs crossed, smile controlled. This was his arena. For years, he had built his reputation on his ability to corner guests, to break them down, to shape their words into something they never intended to say. And tonight, he had something special, someone special, Melania Trump. She sat across from him, her expression unreadable, her posture as still and composed as if she had been carved from marble. Her elegance was undeniable, but so was the mystery surrounding her. She had been scrutinized, analyzed, and speculated about more than almost any first lady in modern history. Yet somehow, she remained an enigma. That was why the world was watching. This wasn't just an interview. This was a spectacle. The host, let's call him Richard Kane, knew the weight of the moment. He had prepared for it. Every question had been curated, every follow-up designed to push her, to reveal something, whether she wanted to or not. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The red light above the camera blinked on. They were live. Richard leaned in slightly, smiling as if he were about to engage in a friendly conversation. The audience knew better. This was not a discussion. This was a chess match. And in his mind, he had already won. Melania, thank you for being here. Her lips curled into the faintest smile. Thank you for having me. The game had begun. He thought he was in control. He thought this was his stage. But what he didn't realize was that the ground beneath him was already shifting. The first few minutes were simple, calculated, softball questions, background, public perception, the things Melania had answered 100 times before. Richard played the part well. At first, he smiled, nodded, even let her speak without interruption. But it was all a setup, a way to make her feel comfortable. And then, like a predator sensing weakness, he went for his first real strike. You've been in the public eye for years, Richard began, his tone shifting just slightly, just enough for the audience to notice. Yet many would say you've remained quiet, almost reluctant. Some have even questioned if you truly wanted to be First Lady at all. A subtle challenge. Melania didn't react immediately. She let the words settle, let the moment breathe. Richard took that as an opportunity to push further. You're often seen standing behind your husband, rarely speaking out unless absolutely necessary. People wonder, is that by choice? Or is it because you feel obligated? The silence in the studio deepened. The audience knew what was happening. They had seen it before, a question designed to create doubt, to make the guest defensive, uncomfortable, uncertain. Richard leaned back slightly, confident that he had set the perfect trap. Melania tilted her head, her gaze unwavering, and then, in a voice smooth, deliberate, and dangerously calm, she responded, "Tell me, Richard, have you asked the same of any other First Lady?" The room shifted. Richard blinked. A fraction of a second, barely noticeable to most. But Melania noticed. The audience noticed. Something had changed. The question, designed to make her justify herself, had just been flipped. Now Richard was the one on the defensive, and Melania wasn't finished. She continued, her tone never rising, her words never rushed. Or is this question only for me? The tension crackled through the room. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time, the interview wasn't following his script. A quiet murmur rippled through the audience. Richard adjusted his tie, exhaled, and forced a chuckle. It's just something people are curious about. Melania didn't break eye contact. Curious or convenient? Silence. In that moment, something happened that Richard never expected. The audience, his audience, laughed not at Melania. At him, the first crack had formed. And before the night was over, the entire foundation of the interview would collapse. One move, one sentence, and the entire conversation had changed. But this was just the beginning. Richard Kane wasn't used to this. He had conducted hundreds of interviews, torn apart seasoned politicians, outmaneuvered the sharpest minds in media. This wasn't supposed to happen. Yet there it was. A single sentence from Melania Trump, and the carefully crafted momentum he had built was gone. For the first time, he was reacting instead of leading. And the worst part? The audience knew it. He cleared his throat, forced a practiced chuckle. It's an honest question, Melania. People want to understand the real you. But Melania wasn't done. She tilted her head slightly, eyes sharp. And do you? Richard hesitated. Do I? Do you want to understand the real me? Or do you want a version that fits your story? The shift in energy was undeniable. The room felt different now. Richard knew he had two choices. Double down, try to regain control. Pivot, try to recover, but at a cost. He chose the first. Richard leaned in, shifting back into attack mode. Let's talk about that then. The story. A lot has been said about you, and let's be honest, you've never been one to actively push back. Doesn't silence often mean agreement? There it was. A question meant to trap her, to frame her as complicit. But Melania, she didn't blink. Instead, she exhaled softly, as if she had been expecting it. Then, with absolute composure, she answered, Richard, when you speak, do you expect the world to agree with everything you say? Another shift. Richard's mouth opened, then closed. Melania pressed forward. Does your silence in certain moments mean you have nothing to say? Or does it mean you are choosing when and how to speak? Silence. Sharp. Uncomfortable. The audience watched, enthralled. Some exchanged glances. Others leaned forward in their seats, sensing something rare, a moment of genuine unpredictability in an interview that was supposed to be scripted. Richard was in trouble, and he knew it. He forced a smirk, trying to play it off. You have to admit, though, your silence on certain matters has led to a lot of speculation. Melania nodded slightly. That is because speculation is easier than listening. A pause, and then laughter. Not at her, at him. The audience had flipped. Richard had spent his career controlling conversations, but tonight, he was the one being led. The cracks in Richard's confidence were showing, but Melania wasn't finished yet. Richard could feel it. The interview was slipping away. The worst part. He wasn't sure how to fix it. He shifted in his chair, glancing at his notes, looking for anything to reset the balance. The tension in the room was electric, and Melania knew it. For years she had been spoken about, analyzed, debated, but rarely had she been the one truly controlling the narrative. Until now. Richard straightened, putting on his best neutral expression. All right, let's move on. A tactical retreat. He needed to regain footing. But the audience? They weren't with him anymore. Every moment Melania sat there, composed, unshaken, she gained ground. Still, Richard pressed on. He had one last play. Many believe that your public image has been carefully crafted to keep you in the background. Some say it's intentional, that you prefer to be quiet, that you prefer to avoid difficult conversations. He leaned forward, giving her the look of a man who thought he had just outmaneuvered his opponent. Do you? Melania raised an eyebrow. And then, in the calmest voice imaginable, she asked, Does this look like avoidance to you? The room erupted. The laughter was louder this time. Not forced, not awkward, but real. Melania's expression remained poised. But for the first time, Richard looked uncomfortable. A shift, a rare, undeniable power shift. Richard chuckled, shaking his head as if to play it off. "You're good," Melania smiled. "I know." And just like that, it was over. The interview continued, but the battle? It had already been decided. He thought he could define her story. But by the time the interview ended, it was clear she had written her own. The interview was over, but the conversation had only just begun. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, clips of Melania's responses flooded the internet. The moment she had turned Richard's questions back on him, trending worldwide, the audience laughing at him instead of her. Instant meme material. Social media exploded. "Melania Trump just schooled Richard Kane on his own show. She walked in as a guest and left as the host. This interview will be studied in media classes for years." The hashtags were everywhere. #Melania, unscripted, #media, bias exposed, #Kane lost control. Twitter was ruthless. Edits of Richard's stunned face circulated, captioned with, "When you realize you walked into your own downfall." Journalists scrambled to put their own spin on the moment. Some praised her for handling loaded questions with elegance and precision. Others, desperate to control the damage, tried framing her as defensive or rehearsed. But the internet had already decided this wasn't just an interview, it was a moment. And moments like these, they don't fade, they change narratives. The world had watched, the world had reacted, but now the fallout was about to begin. Not everyone was laughing. In the headquarters of the network, the executives were already meeting. Richard Kane, one of their biggest names, had just been humiliated on live television. And in a world where control was everything, they had lost it. Phones rang, emails were sent. Damage control began immediately. They needed to flip the narrative fast. By the next morning, certain media outlets were running headlines designed to twist the situation. Melania Trump's aggressive interview leaves viewers divided. Did Richard Kane fall into a political trap? Was this moment rehearsed? Experts weigh in. But something strange happened. People weren't buying it. The comments under those articles? Brutal. Aggressive? She barely raised her voice. You're only mad because she didn't let the media define her. Richard lost. Just admit it. Viewership ratings for the network's primetime shows started dipping, their credibility under fire. And as for Richard, for the first time in his career, he wasn't the one controlling the conversation. He was the conversation. The interview had ended, but his reputation might not survive it. And Melania, she didn't need to respond. She had already won. The media had lost control of the story, and Melania Trump, she had done the impossible. She had changed the game. While the media scrambled to regain footing, Melania did nothing. No statements, no follow-ups, no clarifications. And that was the most powerful move she could make. Because while journalists and commentators fought over the meaning of her words, she had already left the stage, and the world noticed. Why isn't Melania responding? Because she doesn't have to. Silence is power. And she just proved it. Richard Kane is still explaining himself. Melania is already 5 steps ahead. Meanwhile, Richard, he couldn't escape the moment. Every interview he gave afterward, hijacked by the same questions. Do you regret how you handled the interview? Do you feel you underestimated her? Would you do anything differently? Every answer sounded like damage control. Every attempt to move on pulled him back in. And in the court of public opinion, he had already lost. Meanwhile, Melania's moment only grew bigger. TV hosts broke down her responses, showing how she had methodically taken control without ever raising her voice. Psychologists analyzed the power dynamics of the interview, explaining how she had reversed the pressure without ever appearing aggressive. And her most iconic response, Does this look like avoidance to you? It was everywhere. Merchandise, memes, headlines. It wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a cultural shift. The conversation had changed, but the real question was, what came next? Weeks passed. Other stories took over the news cycle. Other controversies filled the airwaves. But the impact of that interview never truly faded. Media analysts dissected it for months. Universities began using it as a case study on media bias and power shifts. And Richard Kane, his reputation never quite recovered. He still had his career, still had his platform. But the aura of untouchability, the sense that he was the one who dictated the rules of engagement, gone. Because now, every time he questioned a guest aggressively, every time he pushed a narrative too hard, people remembered. He tried that with Melania. Look how that went. As for Melania, she remained the same, composed, unbothered. She didn't capitalize on the moment, didn't overplay her victory. She simply let the world watch and come to their own conclusions. And that was the most powerful part of all. Because in an era where everyone is desperate to control the story, she had proven that sometimes the most powerful move is to let the story speak for itself. The moment was over, but its impact, it never truly ended. This moment was unforgettable, but what do you think? Was Melania's response calculated genius or just another media spin? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories that expose the truth behind the headlines, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.